Hello everybody and welcome to the Online Sociologist. My name is Ryan. In this video we're going to look at the topic of theory and we're going to introduce three major theoretical approaches that sociologists use when studying social phenomena. The approaches I'm going to focus on are titled Functionalism, Conflict Theory, and Symbolic Interactionism. Now before getting into what these approaches are, let's attempt to define what a theory actually is. A theory, particularly a social theory, can be defined as a logically organized system of ideas used to explain the causes, relationships, organization, impacts, and trajectory of a structure, institution, or phenomenon. In other words, theories provide researchers with a specific lens to view and understand the world in a particular way. For example, you can look at the same object through a microscope or a telescope and come away with a totally different understanding of what that object is. Scholars come to their theories in multiple ways. One way is a top-down approach, in which scholars simply adopt an already existing theory and apply it to a phenomenon in question. Now, this strategy has a multitude of advantages. For one, the scholar really doesn't have to exert any effort in coming up with a theory because it's already there. Also, in adopting a theory, scholars can link their study up to a larger body of already produced knowledge. This knowledge provides a sort of guidebook containing research questions to ask, how to organize that research, as well as what conclusions can be drawn. Moreover, this knowledge provides something that scholars can compare their own findings and analyses to. Another way theories are come to is by taking a bottom-up approach, or what scholars call grounded theory. While the top-down approach looks at data through specific lenses, scholars utilizing grounded theory collect, review, and analyze data on their own. Through this process, data points are connected and grouped into categories, which are then forged into wholly new sets of relationships. These relationships become the basis of an entirely new theory or perspective of looking at that phenomenon. While grounded theory is definitely worth exploring, this video is going to concentrate on already established theoretical frameworks. To better understand the specific theories of functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, it would be useful to first talk about different levels of analysis. In doing so, let's bring back the metaphor of the microscope and the telescope, and the ways of seeing that each provide. Sociologists usually label microscopic ways of studying phenomenon microsociology. The microsociological approach focuses on small-scale interactions between individuals and groups. This approach provides studies that are richer in detail, thus allowing one a more concrete understanding of the phenomenon being analyzed. Such depth of study, however, positions this phenomenon as unique, making its findings difficult to be applied to other cases. Now, the telescopic approach, or macrosociology, looks at phenomenon through a more extensive institutional and systemic parameters. Such studies are not focused on concrete details, but instead connections and relationships between things. Through this approach, phenomenon studies are seen as more abstract in general, thus given the ability to be applied and compared to similar cases across space and time. So, let's move into our specific approaches. To explain these approaches more effectively, I'm going to structure this explanation through a particular phenomenon, which is economic poverty, and that's defined as the lack of financial resources needed to achieve a minimum standard of living. In other words, I am going to assume how a functionalist, conflict theorist, and symbolic interactionist would study poverty. Functionalism, which in some instances is labeled as structural functionalism, is a macro-sociological approach that looks at how different parts come together to create and maintain the functioning of society. In other words, social relationships, practices, institutions, and phenomena are all explained through their functions to that larger society. Early sociologists such as Herbert Spencer and Emile Durkheim base their sociological studies around the notion that societies are larger organisms whose organizational patterns and systemic relationships bring together different functioning parts to maintain that organism. The functionalist theory saw its apogee in the mid-20th century, particularly with the theories of noted American sociologists Talcott Parsons and Robert K. Merton. These theorists not only looked at how certain groups and institutions adapted and integrated into society, but the functions that they served and the intended and unintended consequences of their operations. While functionalism is still practiced today, this theoretical perspective came under intense scrutiny in the latter half of the 20th century. Now, the reasons for this criticism were mainly due to studies that were considered too abstract, detached from reality, too focused on orderliness, as well as an inability to explain social change. This is why functionalism is considered by many to be a conservative theoretical framework. A functionalist who looks at poverty then wouldn't see poverty as problematic per se, but instead would look at how poverty is functional to the operation of that society. The sociologist Herbert Gans published an analysis in 1994 entitled Positive Functions of the Undeserving Poor, Uses of the Underclass in America. In the article, he looks at how American society has stereotyped the poor as being undeserving, lazy, immoral, and even a threat. However, the article isn't so much about how the poor are labeled, but the larger function of those labels. Here he provides numerous functions. For one, impoverishment creates multiple types of employment geared towards modifying the poor's behavior. Such jobs include people working in the criminal justice system, education, social services, rehabilitation centers, among others. Moreover, the poor function as a scapegoat. Instead of the middle class and upper class looking at how they are actually complicit in the construction of social problems, they simply blame the poor. The poor are also utilized to help reinforce supposed norms in society, whether it relates to family structure or recreational activities. Stigmatizing the poor for broken homes or illegal drug use helps the middle and upper class reinforce such things as their own stable marriages, or the nuclear family, or their own legal drug use. Let's move on to conflict theory. Conflict theory is a macro-sociological approach defined as the idea that conflict between competing interests is the basic animating force of social change in society. This framework is mostly derived from the work of the 19th century scholar Karl Marx, who theorized that class conflict between the owning and non-owning classes is the central driving force of social change throughout history. That conflict was primarily derived through unequal levels of power, how the owning class exerted that power, and how the non-owning class resisted it. Moreover, such conflict not only manifested itself in material clashes, but through the construction of ideologies or ideas. Marx's theories developed and transformed throughout the 19th and 20th century as numerous scholars and schools built upon them to help explain the inequalities in society, whether they were based on race, class, gender, sexuality, or one of a series of other social categories. While functionalism is too heavily focused on order, conflict theory has been criticized for its focus on too much conflict. Moreover, conflict theory is heavily critiqued because its foundational assumption is that society is unequal and that certain power holders in society maintain that inequality. So such criticism is usually provided by those power holders who maintain that any sort of disorder, conflict, or resistance is bad, and anyone who says anything differently is actually attempting to destroy society. So, how would a conflict theorist analyze poverty? Well, they would do it through a class conflict analysis. They would look at the organization and operation of the capitalist class and how they dispossess people of their livelihoods. Karl Marx showcased this in many of his works, but most notably in his book Das Kapital. More recent accounts mostly focus on what is known as neoliberalism, which scholars define as an economic regime that emerged in the late 20th century and is focused on the push for free market capitalism. This shift in economic policy has led to the implementation of more free market measures, such as privatization or transforming public sector industries into for-profit industries. They also focus on other things like deregulation or the loosening of rules that enterprises have to play by. Deregulation has played a large role in the dispossession of workers, especially with increased attack on labor unions whose focus is actually providing protection for workers. This has, in turn, led to increased offshoring, or moving factories and jobs abroad, as well as automation or the use of machines and robots to produce goods. All of these measures, though, have led to vast corporate profits. In fact, the compensation for corporate CEOs has grown by 940% since 1978. During that same time, the average worker's wages adjusted for inflation, really hasn't increased at all, and in some instances has decreased, which has led to the hollowing out of the middle class, increased impoverishment, and more reliance on the public sector for means of subsistence. Symbolic interactionism is a microsociological approach. It focuses on small-scale relationships between individuals and groups while analyzing their interactions and the meaning constructed from them. Moreover, these theorists look at the meaning and construction of symbols within these relationships. This emphasis is vastly different from functionalism that sees individuals as cogs in a machine, and conflict theory that sees individuals trapped in unequal power relations. Symbolic interactionism was primarily developed in the early 20th century, particularly with the theories of George Herbert Mead, Herbert Blumer, Charles Horton Cooley, and Irving Goffman. While this theory provides rich, detailed analysis, many have criticized it for several reasons. Some argue that engaging in such an analysis makes it difficult for researchers to remain objective because they grow close to the subjects that they're studying. Others claim that symbolic interactionists provide scholarship that doesn't apply to other studies and can't be reproduced. So while many critique symbolic interactionists on these tenets, others actually have praised the approach for these very same reasons, thus causing a broader discussion about scientific parameters of sociological analysis and if there are any. So, how would a symbolic interactionist study poverty? Well, they would study those that are impoverished or take on the role themselves. While not a sociologist by trade, Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a hugely influential book entitled Nickel and Dimed on not getting by in America. In it, she takes on the role of working numerous minimum wage jobs and attempting to survive on the paltry wages that she received. Other theorists like Jennifer Sherman, whose book Those Who Work, Those Who Don't, Poverty, Morality, and Family in Rural America, provides an in-depth, long-term study on the impoverishment of rural residents in a small town in Northern California. Her interest wasn't just in the conditions of that impoverishment, but the identities that were constructed in relation to it. She found that many working poor people labeled and stigmatized those who didn't work and who received government aid as undeserving. In other words, while everyone in the town was impoverished, numerous symbolic distinctions were created and drawn between those who work and those who don't. So, there you have it. Sociology's three major theoretical frameworks: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. Let me know what you think in the comments below and if I missed anything. I want to thank you all for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe for more content related to the world of sociology and how it can be used not only in the classroom, but in your everyday lives. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.